Hi, we've already learned about inequalities in the world, and we've also learned a little bit about the history or origins of this inequality. Well, this is lecture number 3, the developing world. Many nations of the world today are called developing nations, which simply means that they are still developing their stability, both politically and economically. Many developing nations are former colonies of European nations. And for instance, much of what we call Latin America today was colonized by Europeans during the 15 and 1600s, during an era of old imperialism, or the age of exploration. Many parts of Africa were colonized during an era of new imperialism, which occurred during the Industrial Revolutionary era. Eventually, these colonies around the globe will win their independence at various times between the 1800s and mid-1900s. But the colonial legacy in these former colonies still exists. Many former colonies struggle to find their place in a rapidly modernizing world. Many still need to go through modernization, which simply means being able to produce a high level of goods and services as a nation. Many of these nations are still trying to industrialize and compete in a Western nation-dominated world. This is what we call the developing world. Developing nations face many challenges. First, many former colonies are still dependent upon cash crops. Cash crops are those types of crops that are grown to make a profit for a nation. They can include cotton, rice, sugar, and coffee. When European nations colonized other countries, they often began growing various cash crops throughout their colonies. There are many former colonies that are still dependent upon cash crops that the Europeans introduced there. Many developing nations are still struggling with political and economic stability as well. Having an economy that is entirely dependent upon cash crops is pretty dangerous. First of all, if that crop fails because of bad weather or insects, the nation's economic livelihood is at stake. Many developing nations are so busy producing these cash crops that they are not able to focus on other areas of development, whether that's industrialization, like road building, or creating a stable infrastructure of schools, hospitals, and factories. There are many reasons why developing nations struggle to modernize. They face many challenges. The first of these challenges is political stability. When Europeans colonized nations of the world, they often redrew political boundaries and borders. Sometimes they would take different ethnic groups and put them in the same nation. Once these countries gained their independence from European nations, these ethnic groups began fighting with one another for political control. This continues to plague many developing nations even today. Political stability is also compromised in many developing nations due to the fact that many of these former colonies were left with unstable systems after European countries withdrew. This has led to recurrent problems in many of these nations today. A second reason that is difficult for developing nations to modernize is due to economic diversity. Without many types of products to export to other nations, and with such a dependence on cash crops, many developing nations struggle to compete with more modernized nations. It's always an unequal playing field for them when trying to do business with modernized nations, giving them a distinct disadvantage over controlling their economic future. Many developing nations had state-owned or run economic systems, sort of like the command economies that we learned about earlier. In order to more readily compete in the world marketplace, many developing nations are starting to sell these state-owned businesses to foreign companies who have money to invest in them. This is called privatization. Privatization simply means that private individuals own companies. This hasn't always had the desired outcomes for developing nations, unfortunately. A third issue that makes modernization in the developing world so difficult is due to education and other services. In many parts of the developing world, literacy rates are fairly low. Literacy means that the ability to read and write. Most people don't have access to the types of educational programs that you're accustomed to here at BHS. In fact, in many parts of the developing world, people can't afford to send their kids to school, and the governments aren't always able to create a universal education program. Other services that are often difficult to manage for developing nations include healthcare, clean water systems, and sanitary sewage systems. All of these things make up a nation's infrastructure. If one area suffers, it tends to have a chain reaction effect on all the other areas. A fourth issue for developing nations includes debt. Many of these countries owe money to lenders or banks around the globe because they borrowed money following independence. The interest rates are often so high on these loans that developing nations struggle to make the minimum payments, and they always remain in debt to other nations. It's a vicious cycle from which they can't escape. Developing nations are often making loan payments to other nations instead of investing in their own infrastructures. A fifth issue includes population explosions. There are 7 billion people in the world today. It takes quite a few resources to feed so many people. Many developing nations have rapidly growing populations. Farming-based traditional societies tend to see larger families than the nuclear family structure we see in cities or the developed world. However, people aren't just having more and more kids in developing nations, believe it or not. Although many nations lack healthcare systems comparable to our own, they still have seen some improvements in healthcare. This improvement has helped to contribute to the population explosion. Access to healthcare in whatever form tends to lead to people living longer in developing nations. So that's really what's causing this strain, not just suddenly people having more kids. The sixth challenge facing developing nations is related to population, urbanization. As populations continue to rise, many people try to find work in cities. Millions of people crowd cities looking for work. For example, Mexico City, which is tied for third place in terms of population in the world, doubled its size between 1980 and 1991, and then again doubled its size between 1991 and the year 2000. Population density is a term used to describe the average number of people living in an area of a specific size. In places like Mexico City, rapid population growth puts tremendous strain on a nation's ability to meet the needs of its people. A seventh issue facing developing nations, cultural change. Life is very difficult between urban and rural areas in developing nations. Many traditions within a given culture have been lost because of changing lifestyles. There is a constantly growing gap between developed and developing nations that only continues to increase. Thanks for listening. Bye.